So the topic I'm going to be talking about today is actually about sustainability and about prevention. But you guys are probably going to see that yourselves as we go through the slides. I must say they're a bit thorough, but I wanted you guys to have a lot of information. This is a new topic. And I think it's really important for us to kind of engage and be interested from the start. So I hope you enjoy. The topic is To Infinity and Beyond, Sustainable Use of Outer Space as the End Game. Okay, so we're first going to go through the overview of the emergence of space law, the background, and of course, then why is it relevant for us today? Then what is space debris, the nexus between that and environmental damages, principles and rules of space law in connection to environmental law, of course, some examples of space environmental damages, how I kind of call them, and then maybe some of your opinions and questions. Of course, you're going to have a lot of useful links at the end that I'll ask to be sent to you guys. So now, regarding the chronological overview, of the emergence of space law. You should know that space law didn't emerge on, let's say, particularly on a national level. It did emerge thanks to one state in question, and it was Russia or SSSR at that time. They launched Sputnik, the first rocket, but no state objected at the time because they were kind of afraid to affect international relations, or so to say, to protest. So therefore emerged a new term in law and a new definition of something called an instant custom. Now, this term is a relative in practice. Not everyone accepts it, but it was a way at that time how to explain something that emerges so fast since you all know very well that customs need some time and practice to begin. But now in this really fast-paced society that we're in today, customs emerge much faster. So abstention of states to protest for some also meant violation of the relevant international obligation or principle. This age was also called a Doctrine of Discovery, which meant that it's attributed to the interest of states to kind of develop this kind of a game to compete who is going to go to space faster, who's going to do it first, who's going to do it more often, who's going to reach further. And that age was called the Doctrine of Discovery, which led to, of course, the emergence of a new dimension of international relations and new rivalry. Now, for this, we also ought to know what is Kármán's line. That is like an invisible boundary that is also makes some issues in practice. It's an invisible boundary between 100 and 110 kilometers above sea level, which then separates two legal regimes, air law and space law. And therefore, because it was never completely formally accepted in practice, and it isn't explicit, for that reason, that can make some issues in interpretation and, of course, effect of law, which is enacted and where. Now, there have been a few really important resolutions that are brought. They're brought in UN General Assembly resolutions. They're, of course, viewed at the beginning as soft law. And you know about soft law, that it isn't completely obligatory unless enough time passes and it becomes like an international custom or is accepted in international conventions. Some of those resolutions were related to extension of international law to outer space and with the UN Charter, which means now that the cognitive law and already accepted customs now expand to space law, which means that we can use some legal transplants and we can interpret space law with having in mind, let's say, the law on Earth. There's also international cooperation in peaceful use of space. Now, the peaceful uses of space is one of the main principles, so to speak. It's similar to the Sustainable Development Principle in a way that it's an umbrella norm. So it's really good to use in a interpretation connection to other principles as well. Now, also, there was a declaration of legal principles, 9 legal principles as basis for the Outer Space Treaty, the OST. That's the main treaty. And one of them, the really important one, is non-appropriation. It's similar to the regimes we have in Antarctica. Then in 1963, there was UN called to all states to refrain from placing facilities with nuclear weapons and any other weapons of mass destruction in orbit around the Earth, as well as installing weapons on celestial bodies and placing them in space in any other way. Now, as you can see, I underlined placing them in space in any other way. As we all know, law should be, if we're all good people, interpreted in good faith, meaning, of course, because here it's just mentioned that they should not be installed, but then what to do with other acts. When you enumerate just certain acts and others you don't, then there's also place for arbitrary interpretation. And that's why in those situations, we should use evolutive approaches, and of course, interpretation in good faith. That same year, there was a treaty on the prohibition of experiments with nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, space, and underwater. Now it's open for all. And after those principles, after they were a bit crystallized, let's say, in practice, there were the 5 main UN treaties as well. One of them is, of course, our Space Treaty, which is the main treaty. They call it the Constitution of Space, and it's based on Antarctic Treaty. There's the Rescue Agreement on rescuing astronauts, returning them and returning the launching objects from outer space if they're lost or they fall. And there, it's kind of based on the law of the open sea. Liability Convention. Well, Liability Convention has certain definitions. We'll talk about that later. Registration Convention, that's maybe the one of the best defined ones. And Moon Agreement, that's not completely accepted by the states, and it only refers to the moon, while the Outer Space Treaty, it refers to other celestial bodies until special conventions are brought. Now, again, why is this important to us today? There's a few reasons in history why we should take into account, let's say, a precautionary principle and, prevention in general, and then take into account, of course, sustainable development. Why? I don't know, some of you might know about Star Wars project. That was a Ronald Reagan Strategic Defense Initiative. Let's say that the US at that time invested in war equipment because there was a scientist called Dr. Strangelove, Edward Teller, who predicted climate modifications, human climate modifications as potential cause of last war on Earth, warning that Russia at that time possessed technology sufficient enough to affect that and produce climate change. Now, what happened? There was a report of the American Society of Physics mentioning exactly the opposite. Of course, Russia at that time wasn't developed enough to make such a technology, and that led Russia to bankruptcy. That strategic initiative. And then Donald Trump, of course, recently had a statement that America will invest in air and space military forces, signed the Space Policy Directive, ordering the Pentagon to establish the Space Forces as 6th branch of U.S. military, which is now ongoing. The problem, here being not that this is done, but what do we put the focus on, and how the situation is developed in history. Now, Elon Musk, of course, we're all proud of achievements he's done, but then we have to ask questions. If somebody becomes a really important not political figure, but important figure, let's say an influencer, it's really important what you say, what you do, how you do it, of course. And to shift your mind from maybe profit and the game to something else. So Elon, what he did, he declared independence in a way, making the worldwide, the internet is going to expand to everywhere, the Starlink internet project. He proclaimed Mars a free planet, meaning that he stated that Earth-based laws are not going to be applicable to outer space, that they will make their own self-governing principles at the time of the settlement. Now, I'm going to ask you later on, why do you think this is problematic exactly, but having in mind one principle in particular in space, which is non-appropriation, and how this sounds in that context. Now, terraforming, that's pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere by dropping nuclear bombs on the planet. Wasn't quite tested yet, but already he made a campaign, Let's Nuke Mars, on Twitter, let's say maybe a year or two ago. SpaceX now is, well, this maybe not the most recent information, I think as of now even more, is launching sets of 60 satellites every couple of weeks and has received approval for 12,000 Starlink satellites. It's taking for approval for 30,000 more. That mega constellation could increase the number of active satellites more than tenfold. There's a lot of them right now, really a lot, which brings us to light pollution as well, which can be a potential threat to discoveries of near asteroids or Starlink's confusing targets. As of now, I know they're working on them being less brighter, and then he's making renewable satellites, which is good. Now we have a new, not a new actor, they practically started almost the same time. And as they say for Jeff Bezos, he dreamed of this as a child. But now it's really problematic that he went to space for only 4 minutes. Well, you know that you have Twitter campaigns and everywhere, that money combined from all of them wouldn't hurt them at all if they would invest that money in something else like COVID safety and poverty and something else. So, but he's claiming that the entire polluting industry must be moved to space in order to preserve the Earth. And now, aren't we doing the same thing then? Having in mind the precautionary and preventive principle and sustainable development. We'll see. Okay. And now this is also, I have to say that NASA doesn't really update their data that often, but this was, I think even this data would shock you. Latest NASA data from 2011 and 13 indicates there were more than 500,000 pieces of space debris, which is space waste, between 1 and 10 centimeters in diameter, more than 10 of millions of particles smaller than 1 centimeter. Okay, so you should know that those smaller than 1 centimeter until up recently weren't very visible, really hard to detect. So then you have the US Space Surveillance Network, monitors only 22,000 objects larger than 10 centimeters, including about 1,000 operational spacecraft, while all of the rest is orbital debris. The latest ESA, European Space Agency data, about 5,000 objects in space with a total mass of 8,400 tons, around of 1,950 dysfunctional, 34,000 objects is assessed by statistical data, and 900,000 items smaller than 10 centimeters, and 128 million smaller than 1, which cannot be detected. The higher the altitude, the longer the debris will remain in our orbit. So, and most of the space debris is located in the low Earth orbit, and it's really fast. It moves really fast, 7 to 8 kilometers per second speed, which means that the average object debris collision speed is also approximately 10 kilometers per second, meaning that even smaller collisions could make huge amounts of trash, and because they use huge amounts of energy. Like, let's say even a small piece of like a stain on the spacecraft could damage in that speed an entire spacecraft. Now, not the new ones, of course, but we haven't removed the old ones. NASA just kind of expects them. They began some missions, removing the spacecraft, but there's also testing them recently. So the old spacecraft, they kind of stay and slowly fall down. And unlike today's spacecraft, we do not have how to remotely move them and steer them to fall in a certain direction. I remember one statement from a NASA official was, I don't know, 60% or 70% of Earth is sea, so it's most probably going to fall in sea. We don't have to worry. Kessler syndrome. That's a theoretical scenario where the density of objects in low Earth orbit due to space pollution is high enough that object collision could create a cascade in which each collision generates more space debris than which increases the likelihood of further collisions, like a chain effect. The main cause of pollution in space is therefore space waste, that is space debris, that is also or orbital debris, that could create space damages, which coincide with environmental damages, and we'll talk about that just now. And those are all dysfunctional people-made objects. You have the definition here. They're fragments and elements in lower orbit or re-entering into atmosphere. Now, environmental damages, they're unbreakably connected with undertaking economic and industrial activities, which means that the question of compensation is only raised for damages that exceed allowed limits with greater harmful consequences, especially if they're transboundary. They usually arise from permitted, socially beneficial activities, meaning even economically beneficial, that involve the risk of environmental damage, while the action itself is permissible usually. So the occurrence of damage, it does not exclusively depend on the will of the one who does that. Occurrence of damage is not always a predictable event. The effect of several causes, because they usually have several causes of environmental accidents, is often acquired. It's difficult to determine the responsibility of just one person or subject, which is why joint and several liability of multiple operators or polluters is most often applied. It is still difficult to see all their effects because they can occur late or cumulatively, gradually, or late. If we take into account that space activities are permitted, but dangerous, high-risk industrial activities, where entrepreneurs of such activities agree to implied risks, and since space exploration presumes the impossibility for complete and exact prior knowledge of all potential causes and dangers, that would say that the space damage can be a type of environmental damage, or can in itself presume one of the types can be environmental damage, maybe even the most often one. Now, we have the basic environmental principles that are most important, and then we can maybe use as transplants that we should take into account. So there's a sustainability principle, the principle of compensation for damage, precautionary principle, prevention, impact assessment, ecological information, and public participation, of course. Now, state liability for environmental damage, it implies the broadest forms of original liability for illegal actions against foreign countries at the international level, and for administrative errors that cause damage from environmental accidents. That's called a vicarious responsibility of the state for everything that happens in its territory. Now, two fields of law here regarding responsibility apply: international commercial law and international private law. Let's say that international commercial law, that state liability for damages within international agreements, with accepting the risk of damages that have the regional, or transboundary, and in this case, even planetary proportions. And public law, the state has obligation to other states to respect international agreements in the field of environmental protection, and also to guarantee its citizens the protection of their environmental rights. So the result is a regime of parallel responsibilities of the operator who causes damage. And of course, the state responsibility, the state that should control such activities on its on the use of such activities or use of dangerous goods. That indicates the acceptance of risk management model, risk dispersion, because not one of those parties could bear it with their entire property. That kind of creates an insurance system. Precisely because of the broad understanding of the concept of the environment and given the unpredictability of the scope of human actions in nature. This is why I at least think we should move towards prevention due to the frequent failure to completely remedy and assess even the multiple consequences and effects. It's also, prevention is in many conventions similar to nuclear law, and if we use it as transplants, is extended to imply the costs of preventive measures taken to protect the existing situation and to reestablish the disturbed environment. Now, some principles from space law. Outer Space Treaty, we already said it was Magna Carta of Cosmos. Role model was the Antarctic Treaty. Main principles, non-appropriation, peaceful exploration, but the problem is that it does not completely forbid using military nuclear weapons for scientific purposes, scientific basis, and use of weapons and testing, and those purposes are still permitted. And you guys know that we still have the same problem on Earth, where it's no matter how much we would like to interpret it that way, formally, ICJ opinion didn't completely prohibit that. The Rescue Treaty, it incorporates the principle of law of salvage from the law on high seas, and it sees astronauts as envoys of mankind, like representations of humankind. Due diligence here is implied. Liability Convention provides for the definition of liability and damages, but has really vague terms and doesn't provide for a special court or any dispute resolution or supervisory body aside from UN peaceful mechanisms that are implied. Registration Convention may be the only one that is clearer, more precise, because every single convention kind of ties to the previous one. They kind of, a registration convention, it's a concretization of the terms from the Liability Convention, and it facilitates attributing damages to the state of registry where the object is registered, which was failed to be done by the Liability Convention. And sometimes you would get confusion which state is liable. Now, Moon Agreement regulates comparable matter in more detail, goes further, and it's more environmentally oriented. It even has some principles about like sustainable use and salvage and of resources you find on the moon. So it's really, really, really good convention, but it's not accepted, and it only applies to the moon itself. We have an insufficiently strict emphasis on duties of contracting parties in space contract by formulating obligations as possibilities or conditioning certain duties only by the existence of requests of the states, reciprocity, and existence of practical possibilities for their realization. Under development and ambiguity of the primary norms, it complicates the interpretation and application of secondary norms for damage or crimes or torts or whatever happens of the Outer Space Treaty, Liability Convention, and Moon Agreement. Now, main shortcomings, we already kind of talked about this. They're not mutually harmonized. There are a lot of legal gaps, ambiguities. They can be subject to arbitrary interpretation that can lead to abuse of rights. And environmental protection in space in Earth's orbit, LEO, is only established in principle without any corresponding strict obligations. And when obligations are not strict, it's really hard to have the criminal aspect of that or any secondary norms that can be applicable. So no space agreement has a sufficiently developed, legally binding primary norm in the field of prevention of space waste generation, environmental principles of sustainable development, precaution, prevention, and other principles. They've been just somewhat adequate, adapted to damages in space, but still not connected enough. We cannot say the same for the procedural principles, like effectiveness of the principle of compensation. It is relativized by making it dependent on diplomatic relations between states and the balance of powers in international relations due to the lack of impartial independent supervisory bodies. Despite the similarities of nuclear and space sectors, high risk, dangerous activities, serious consequences that cannot always be assessed, there is a significant difference between their legal regime, as nuclear law provides strict liability of private operators, while space law imposes absolute liability on the state. So unlike the law of the sea, air, nuclear law, space law places responsibility on the state. Since participation of private actors is now becoming more frequent, we should maybe reconsider to shift the responsibility from the state to the field of civil responsibility, and requiring insurance for space activities as a mandatory precondition could achieve that. Now, the problem is that no extensive changes have been made in years due to the reluctance of states to accept legally binding and strict obligations in the field of arms race prevention and liability. And so we can interpret the vague terms. We, of course, need to take a look at other related branches of law, and of course soft law as well. Here we have Treaty on the Prohibition of Experiments on Nuclear Weapons in the Atmosphere, Outer Space, and Underwater. So it's proclaimed to expand to space, and Convention on the Prohibition of Military or any other hostile use of environmental modification techniques, and Moot Convention. They provide for principles of peaceful exploration of outer space, sustainable development, principles of humanity, military necessity, distinction, proportionality, formally extending their scope to outer space, which is good because if you interpret it in good faith, could kind of help the umbrella norm of the peaceful use of outer space or sustainable development by connecting them into making something more, something better, since the nuclear weapons are not completely banned. They can only be used for peaceful purposes. They can only be used if it's a military necessity. You have to take into account distinction, proportionality, and this is some kind of my interpretation of an understanding of those conventions. Environmental principles of prevention and precaution and peaceful exploration use outer space actually can fall under due diligence. Principles relevant to the use of nuclear power sources of outer space. Then we have also the safety framework for the application of nuclear energy sources, but it does not expand to the protection of people and natural environment to outer space. So that's good. We have principles relevant to the use of nuclear power sources in outer space. And let me say something. They're really more thoroughly developed and more explicit. So if you read the conventions, having in mind all these codes and principles, you're going to interpret it in good faith, and it's going to start to make sense. Also, there's a code of conduct against ballistic missile proliferation and code of conduct for space activities. They connect the arms race issues with the environmental damage in outer space or with sustainability, and code of conduct for space activities. Also references to all of the space law sources, the main 5 treaties, the OST, the Liability Convention, Rescue Convention, Moon Agreement, and also refers to the space debris mitigation guidelines. We have the European version, the international version, and now they're working, finally agreeing into making them into a wider acceptance of those guidelines, as I can see, also updating them. But that was until recently, and I think still the only document that explicitly regulates space debris or space waste. Now we have some examples of environmental damages. and in outer space. I'm just gonna mention there was a French satellite that fell in 1996, Chinese anti-satellite test, a Russian dysfunctional satellite. There are also damages caused to third parties that don't participate. They can occur more on Earth than in space. In 1986, Titan rocket exploded. The damages were 40 million. And Tor Abelstar rocket, there was that. It killed a cow. Human victims also, we have those. And then there's some more serious projects like Ford project, which Westport project created a disruption to radio astronomy and other observation techniques. In the 60s, we had series of high altitude nuclear explosions that also created a lot of damage, were followed by the introduction of environmentally oriented provisions. Space launch complex of the city of Baikonur in Kazakhstan is interesting because the liability convention usually excludes from its application damages incurred on the territory that occur in the territory of the launching state, the state that launches, and then national law applies. But what happened here, the lease agreement provided that in the event of damage to the Baikonur launch complex in connection with Russian space programs, Russia would be liable as a launching state. So they already pre-decided who's going to be liable. So we didn't lose liability here, and no confusion was made. The most popular, let's say, case was Cosmos 954, which is the case when there was a crash and on the territory of Canada from the side of USSR, and that's the first time in history to use the norms of liability convention, Article 2. And there was an omission of USSR. They only admitted that it was theirs, so they were tied to responsibility, but they said it was insignificant local pollution. There was an Operation Morning Star by the Canadian government, which remedied the situation that happened. And
hey, Tamara, can you wrap it up? We've got to get to the next speaker.
Okay, no problems. Let me just, okay. So that's the main point. As you can see here, it was a lot. It led to the subsequent adoption of principles in the field of nuclear energy sources and concretization of certain terms and obligations in the liability convention. This is kind of about it. I hope you liked it, and I hope it was interesting. I also hope I haven't talked too fast. You can ask me for some links. I provided here for you links for reading and a lot of links for news. So you just let me know. Also, there's a blog if you're interested on this subject, a shorter version of this presentation, also about this that you can read on the Washington State Bar website. You have it here, the link. And also there is an upcoming book, and some of the speakers here also wrote some chapters in that book, and that's a book on green crimes. You can also add me if you want on LinkedIn. I'd love to connect, and Twitter if you want. Okay, thank you.